Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news, and amid all the cost cap drama, Mercedes have implied that if Red Bull do not get a strict penalty for breaching the cost cap, as indeed it seems they have done, they will also overspend in future seasons and potentially do what it takes to get their car back to the front of the field. Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoy, subscribe if you're new as always, I'd greatly appreciate it. This is just one example of the plentiful memes that have been coming out already. You know, the catering budget could get rather significant for Mercedes in the upcoming season. Firstly, a few updates on the driver front. Théo Pourchaire, Formula 2 driver, he's going to be driving in FP1 for Alfa Romeo at the United States Grand Prix coming up shortly. So that's pretty cool for Pourchaire, good name in Formula 2. Haas, though, they haven't decided what's happening yet. Mick Schumacher, I believe, said that he would be surprised if that shunt he had at the end of FP1 back in Japan would cost him his seat next year. They're in discussions with him. They've admitted, like, look, he's got better. We maybe should keep him, maybe we won't, who knows. Like, I think he'll still have a seat next season in Formula 1 somewhere. Hopefully he does. I think he definitely has done enough to deserve it, but they will not be announcing anything along those lines quite as of yet. This on Lando Norris as well, because I think he's driven phenomenally this year. Arguably the most impressive driver of the season outside of Max Verstappen, I suppose, considering that the machinery that Norris is in and Riccardo's performance on the majority, and as he even said, so no idea how they're still fighting with Alpine, the constructors. They're so much quicker than us. And he even went on to say that he doesn't expect race victories for a couple of seasons, right? And this is the thing with Norris's long-term deal and long-term contract with McLaren, is that he's kind of locked into a team that hasn't really been delivering competitive cars for several years at this point. And yeah, he doesn't reckon even next year they're going to be fighting for race wins. The remarkable thing is that outside of Ferrari, Red Bull and Mercedes, the only team and only driver to have got a podium this season in the entire season so far has been Lando Norris, right? He got third back in Imola. Since then, it's been all Red Bull, Ferrari, Mercedes on the podium. So, you know, impressive stuff from Norris, I think, on the whole. Until then, it's a patience game, he says, which is not the nicest thing because I do get frustrated. Like this year, we weren't as competitive as we'd want. So Norris, I think, often comes over as kind of like a nice guy, but I know that he's got this real deep, burning desire to win races, and that's probably not going to happen, even he admits, for at least a couple of seasons. And I'm sure if that happens, then he's going to be like, well, you know, I need to get out of here ASAP. One team that has been creeping up the standings has, of course, been Aston Martin. I thought this was quite the kind of, well, thing that they did right earlier today, announcing Pedro Della Rosa, legendary Formula 1 driver from several years ago, joining them as a team ambassador. This got a lot of traction on Twitter, 21,000 likes here. So yeah, just yet again, Aston Martin, they're making moves, and Alonso's looking at this, I'm sure, thinking, you know, damn, Aston Martin, they're looking a bit better. Their car the last few races made great progress. Now they're bringing on, you know, big team ambassadors like Della Rosa, and then they've got other guys on board as well. They're bringing in engineers from other teams. So Aston Martin definitely have high ambitions. Whether they create an absolute tractor next year, again, we'll see. But Alonso is, of course, most certainly hoping that they do not. Let's talk about the cost cap. So Brundle and others have said, look, the fact that this is a minor breach for the $1.8 million we believe Red Bull are over the $145 million budget cap for the 2021 season. Whether that's minor or major obviously depends on your interpretation. By the rules, it's a minor breach, and therefore we believe Verstappen will not be docked his championship. That has been kind of confirmed, not necessarily confirmed, but talked about from a couple of sources that they say, yeah, Verstappen's not going to have any issues with reductions in points for the 2021 season. That championship is locked in. However, if that is the case, the question then arises, well, that would, I suppose, be the maximum punishment if, I suppose, Red Bull from a constructors and Verstappen and Perez from a drivers were to be deducted points for last season because their car was developed, you know, with money that wasn't illegally prescribed, let's just say. They're probably not going to do that. That means if they don't do that, what then is the next punishment? The teams are pushing for maximum punishment, as of course they are incentivized to do, but they've got some other options. They can just do a fine, they can just do a reprimand of sorts, they can reduce budget cap for future seasons, and what they decide to do here for Red Bull is going to very much dictate what the teams will decide to do in future seasons. Even Toto Wolff has said, look, I mean, this had a big impact on the championship. Even Hamilton said an extra $300,000 for a new front wing might have swung the balance of the championship in Mercedes' favour last year. And Toto's like, look, that word minor probably isn't correct in this instance because 1.8 million could do an awful lot for the championship. So look, if they don't change the outcome, if they don't change the results, as I don't think we'd really expect them to, then what is the next step, right? What are they going to do instead? And if they don't really clamp down hard, then what might Mercedes do next season? Because look, if they see the FIA not really doing much about this budget cap, and the budget cap doesn't really seem to have teeth, like Rosborn said a few years ago when this was first announced, then what are Mercedes and Ferrari going to do? Because they have the budget to spend way more than they are spending under these budget cap conditions. They spent way more in the past. So they now find themselves in a position where they could potentially budget in a fine so they can spend the absolute maximum, right? And that's even what Christian Horner said a couple of years ago we looked at yesterday when he said, look, the teams are going to spend their budget cap and then they're going to spend 10% more. That seemingly is what Red Bull have done to a certain degree. Now, Helmut Marko says he's been talking to the FIA because Red Bull are still adamant they haven't overspent. They, I guess, don't want the reputational association with that. But he says that their numbers are correct and they submitted below the cap and that's all fine. But the FIA disagrees on certain points and says, you know what, look, we want to count this and you said you shouldn't count this. So that's why the budget cap's a bit of a mess because it's not everything. It's just certain things they decide to be counted, which I think makes sense, but it does also create this ambiguity that all the team's accountants will be attempting to exploit. And, well, Red Bull maybe haven't got it right on this occasion. Helmut Marko, though, also said from Red Bull, that, yeah, rumours that he's going to lose that world title from last year are complete nonsense. Definitely not going to happen. So, yeah, if they don't do that, what is the next step they might decide to do? And even as Zach Brown says what they do, because he even said from the CEO of McLaren's perspective, like, they need to come down hard. All the teams are going to say this because, look, 9 teams stuck to the budget cap. 2 teams had procedural breaches, Williams and Aston Martin. They didn't breach the cap, but they filled in a form wrong. The one team that did breach the cap won last year's championship, dominated this year's championship, and people are going to say, well, look, maybe there's a reason for that. So therefore, what will the other teams do? If the FIA come out and say, you know what, Red Bull, yeah, we maybe disagree on some things, you know what, let's just slap a big finally $50 million fine for the $1.8 million breach. Red Bull will be like, yeah, okay, fair enough, that's absolutely fine, because they'll happily pay that, right? Because they were spending way more money than this in the past, and Mercedes will be like, well, damn, we can easily budget in a $50 million fine to spend $2 million extra if that's what they believe is going to take to turn the tide of the championship. So apparently Toto Wolff has declared that he is ready to spend more money than is available under the budget cap if Red Bull are able to get away with just a fine. This is, I don't know if Mercedes fully will commit to this or whether they're just kind of making this point to say, well, you know what, the FIA, you've got to do something here, because otherwise the budget cap isn't really the budget cap. The budget cap becomes, cap plus 5% or whatever, because the teams will just spend what they can and then happily pay effectively a luxury tax, an extra fine, to spend the most they possibly can. So this, I think, is Mercedes really saying, look, FIA, do the damage to Red Bull, otherwise you're making a mockery of your own budget cap effectively. But seemingly he's saying, well, look, if Red Bull get away with this, either with a big fine or whatever, then Mercedes and other teams will happily do the same to gain the advantage they believe they would have gained if this had happened a different way, as apparently is described in the article. In Mercedes, they have already talked about it, and if that were really the point to fall, the team is ready to plan extra budget and subsequent fines to recover performance and return to the tops. This is the key issue, right? That Mercedes would be willing, if the FIA don't clamp down, to just spend whatever they need to and add the fine on top of that to recover the performance. Now, of course, there is a world in which the FIA said, you know what, Red Bull, it was the first year of the cap, we'll let you get away with this one with a fine, and then next year it's like, well, you had your warning, guys, that's the championship for Mercedes, take it away. So that's the kind of risk that Mercedes run here, but like, I'm sure they're hoping for some transparency for the FIA, as of course are the entire Formula One community, because transparency on controversial issues in the past, let's say, Spygate scandal, or also Ferrari's illegal engine, don't always come out to the public eyes. Hopefully this time it's a rather different story, but yeah, what do you guys think about that, right? So let's say Toto Wolff comes out and next year Mercedes happen to just interpret the cost cap a little bit differently. Maybe they buy some extra premium food for Roscoe, and then all of a sudden that money's getting pumped into new upgrades for the car. So look, I guess we'll just have to see, but I mean, Mercedes could next year come out and say, depending on what the FIA do, say, well, we're going to absolutely break the bank to make this happen. So look, will Mercedes next year spend an ungodly amount of money and happily pay whatever fines they might have to misinterpret the cap accidentally and build an absolute rocket ship? Well, then maybe they could. They probably can't, because if they were to spend an ungodly amount of money, they would get called up and probably disqualified for the championship. But I'm sure they're thinking, well, look, you can't disqualify us next year if we do the same as what Red Bull did this year and they only get a fine or a reprimand or whatever. Probably what I expect to happen here is that the FIA will not take away any championships, but they might well deduct significant budget from future seasons, and they'll say, well, look, you overspent by 2 mil, in next year you can have to underspend by 4 mil or something. That might be the way to do it. And I kind of think that the fact that Mercedes are considering this is more as kind of to try and tell the FIA, look, be serious about this or you're going to have a mess on your hands, rather than fully committing to it. But look, if the FIA don't do much, then I wouldn't be surprised if they do exactly this going forward. So what do you expect, right? Obviously, this really depends on the FIA's decision, their outcome, on what kind of feedback they give to Red Bull, because look, they're still in discussions with Red Bull, trying to say, well, Red Bull are trying to convince them that actually they are within the cap, but that probably isn't going to change on that front. So then it's a matter of Red Bull really just trying to say, you know what, we didn't really know this loophole, we thought it was there, it wasn't really there, just slap us with a bit of a fine or whatever, and we'll happily pay it. But then it brings all the other teams into the scandal as well. So definitely intrigued to your perspective on all this stuff in the comments section below, but it's no doubt that Verstappen has dominated this year's championship. Thought this was quite remarkable, actually. This is the biggest kind of, points deficit overturned to become the Drivers' Champion since 2010. We've seen a few examples, Vettel in 2012 and 2010 overcoming some hurdles that season. 44 points behind Alonso in 2012 was one of them, and then Hamilton in 2014 and 2017 came from behind to win. 3 out of 5 here are, well, Ferrari cars, right, which is maybe somewhat telling that Ferrari are rather good at throwing away championships. 2017 Vettel, 2012 Alonso, and of course this year Charles Leclerc. And the funny thing is that Verstappen was 46 points behind Charles Leclerc after, I guess, Australia, and since then has just romped away with the championship to win with 4 races to go. So kind of incredible, one of the lesser known stats, I suppose, of this entire season. But very much intrigued to your thoughts on all this in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.